The air in the spire of Ethelgard usually smelled of sterile nitrogen and the faint, expensive scent of synthetic jasmine. Now it smelled of ozone and burning hair. Kalen Voss did not run. He was 62, and his knees were a mosaic of titanium grafts and regret. But he moved with a predatory efficiency that made the younger security guards clear the path. In his right hand, he clutched a battered matte black drone that looked like a piece of salvaged shrapnel. In his left, he held the trembling hand of a child whose feathers were glowing a terrified, jagged violet. Mnemonic, status! Kalen barked at the ceiling. The station's AI responded instantly, its voice a calm, curated baritone. The Vane hegemony has breached the outer ice shell, sir. Thermal lances are cutting through the residential sector. Your board of directors has officially declared you incapacitated by cognitive decline. Cassian Vane is currently 3 minutes from this corridor. Leora? Kalen looked back. The Syrinx woman was a shadow in the dim emergency lighting. Her bioluminescent plumage, usually a soft amber of professional submission, was now a sharp defensive crimson. She held a pulse pistol with the familiarity of someone who had spent a lifetime expecting the worst. The escape pod is prepped, Kalen, Leora said, her translation collar struggling to keep up with her rapid, melodic trills. But the maglocks are being jammed from the bridge. Sloan did it. She's locked us in. Kalen stopped at a junction of cold obsidian and gold inlay. He looked down at Pip, the child who had started all of this. She wasn't looking at the encroaching soldiers or the red flashing lights. She was staring at the drone in Kalen's hand. He's scared, Uncle Kalen, Pip whispered. The bird. He's screaming in my head. It's just a machine, Pip, Kalen lied, his voice rasping like gravel. It doesn't feel... So. You're lying, Pip said, her amber eyes wide and luminous. You fixed his heart. You know he remembers. A thunderous boom shook the station. Dust from the comet's ancient ice fell from the ceiling like frozen stars. Kalen adjusted his grip on the drone, the Sentry 7 recon unit he had nicknamed Sparrow during a war that was supposed to stay buried. He looked at the luxury of his foyer, the black marble floors, the statues of gods he didn't believe in. It all felt like a mausoleum now. Leora, take the child to the ventilation shafts, Kalen ordered. I'll meet you at the hangar. If I'm not there in 10 minutes, launch without me. Kalen, no! Leora started, her feathers ruffling in a wave of emerald protest. That's an order, logistics lead, Kalen roared, the commander of the Scorched Nebula returning for a fleeting, terrifying second. Then his voice softened. Please, I started this war 10 years ago. I'm not letting it finish her. As they disappeared into the shadows, Kalen turned to face the heavy blast doors. He wasn't a billionaire anymore. He wasn't a CEO. He was a mechanic with a broken riddle in his hand, and the monsters were finally at the door. 72 hours earlier. The silence of the spire was Kalen's favorite commodity. It was the only thing his billions couldn't always buy. Yet tonight, it was absolute. He had just returned from a board meeting on Nexus Prime, a 12-hour theater of mass and legal daggers. Cassian Vane had smiled at him while trying to vote him out of his own company. Sloan, his brilliant counsel, had whispered about exit strategies and reputation management. Kalen hated the word management. It was a corporate euphemism for lying. He stepped into the residential wing, unfastening his silk tie. It felt like a noose made of wealth. He wanted a glass of amber synth whiskey and the cold comfort of the view, the vast, empty Ort Vale stretching out into the dark. Then he heard it. It wasn't a sound that belonged in the spire. It wasn't the hum of the life support or the rhythmic clicking of the maintenance spiders. It was a wet, hitching intake of breath, a sob, fragile and small. Kalen followed the sound. His instincts, honed in the mud of a dozen moons, flared. He found her in the alcove outside the primary nursery. Pip was curled into a ball, her Syrinx feathers a dull, mournful gray. In her lap lay a mess of twisted alloy and frayed wiring. Kalen stood over her, his shadow long and imposing. It's past curfew, Pip. Your mother will be looking for you. The girl gasped, her head snapping up. Tears tracked through the fine down on her cheeks. She tried to hide the object behind her back, pressing her spine against the velvet wallpaper. I am sorry, Master Voss, she squeaked, the translation collar trembling. I tripped. I didn't mean to break it. Please don't send us to the lower decks. Kalen's eyes didn't leave the object. He reached out a hand. "Give it to me." "Please don't throw him away," Pip pleaded, her feathers flickering with a desperate pale blue light. "He's my only friend." Kalen took the object. It was heavy, cold. He ran a thumb over the chassis, and his breath hitched. He knew this design, the quad-rotor configuration, the specific curve of the optical housing, the matte black finish designed to absorb sensor sweeps. It was a Sentry 7, a Wraith unit. Memories he had spent a decade drowning in whiskey surged back. The smell of burning forests, the shriek of Searing's families as the nebula turned into a furnace, the sound of this very drone's hum as it designated targets for the orbital strikes. "Where did you get this?" Kalen asked, his voice coming out as a harsh, jagged rasp. "It was in the trash that is not trash room," Pip whispered, referring to his private archive of war trophies. "He was lonely, Master, so I took him. I called him Sparrow." "Sparrow," Kalen repeated, the word tasting like ash. "This isn't a bird, Pip. It's a ghost." The sound of frantic footsteps echoed down the hall. Leora skidded around the corner, her breathing ragged. When she saw Kalen holding the drone and her daughter cowering, the color drained from her face. She dropped to her knees, her forehead nearly touching the marble. "Master Voss, please!" Leora cried, her feathers vibrating in a terrifying display of submission. "She is a kitten. She knows nothing of your things. Punish me. I left the door unlatched. I am the one who failed." Kalen looked at the mother, then at the child. He saw the same terror he had seen 10 years ago on the faces of people whose lives he had ended with a single command. He looked at his own hands, clean, manicured, yet stained with the invisible blood of a sector. He did something then that defied every protocol of the Spire. He sat down. His aging joints protested, but he lowered himself until he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eye level with Pip. The silence in the corridor was absolute. Leora lifted her head, her eyes wide with bewilderment. "The stabilizer on the Sentry 7 is a piece of garbage," Kalen said softly. He held the drone up. "They used a cheap titanium poly blend. If you bank too hard to the left, the shear stress snaps the wing mount. It was a design flaw we complained about for years." Pip blinked, her tears pausing. You know him." "I knew his brothers," Kalen said. He looked at the broken wing. "And I think I can fix him, but my fee is very high." Pip's face fell. She reached into her tunic and pulled out a shiny copper washer in a smooth piece of space glass. "I have these." Kalen pretended to consider the offer. "A washer and a glass stone? Tempting, but my fee is one genuine smile. No fake teeth. Payable when Sparrow flies again. Deschartson." Pip's feathers shifted from gray to a warm budding yellow. "Really?" "Really," Kalen said. He stood up, the drone in his hand feeling less like a weapon and more like a bridge. "Come. The light in my workshop is better, and mnemonic is a terrible conversationalist when I'm working alone." Leora stood up slowly, her hands trembling. "Master, why?" Kalen didn't look back. "Because, Leora, I've spent my whole life breaking things. I'd like to see if I still remember how to put them back together." They walked toward his private sanctum, unaware that inside the drone's cracked memory core, a long dormant signal had just detected a familiar heartbeat. A wraith was waking up, and it was bringing the war with it. The workshop was a cathedral of high technology tucked into the highest spire of the comet's core. It was a space where billionaire Kalen Voss shed the skin of a CEO and returned to the raw, binary truth of an engineer. Tools sat in magnetic levitation trays, humming with a low-frequency pulse. Scanners projected holographic wireframes of starship engines against the obsidian walls. But tonight, the centerpiece of the vast room was not a warp drive or a fusion cell. It was a battered, matte black drone sitting on a slab of white kinetic marble. Pip sat on a high ergonomic stool, her feet dangling a foot above the floor. Her Searing's feathers were a cautious, shimmering silver blue, mirroring the cool light of the workshop. Beside her, Leora stood like a sentinel, her feathers ruffled in a defensive posture she couldn't quite suppress. She looked at the expensive machinery with the suspicion of a refugee who knew that power was rarely kind. Kalen peered through a magnifying ocular lens, his hands steady despite the tremor that usually haunted his mornings. He was holding a neurosolder, a tool that looked more like a surgeon's scalpel than a mechanic's iron. The tip glowed with a pinpoint of violet heat. "Every screw is a riddle," Kalen muttered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air filtration system. "You don't force the answer. You listen to the metal. You wait for it to tell you where it's hurting." Pip leaned in, her amber eyes reflecting the glow of the solder. "Does Sparrow hurt?" she whispered. Kalen paused. He looked at the jagged scar on the drone's chassis where a piece of shrapnel had once torn through the armor. He remembered the night that scar happened. It had been during the siege of the Viridian Moons. He had been a commander then, a man who viewed soldiers as variables and drones as disposable assets. "Machines don't feel pain, Pip," Kalen said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "They just experience malfunctions. But this one, he's been through a lot. He's had his heart broken more than once." "I fixed my feather dolls with star glue," Pip said, her voice full of a child's absolute certainty. "But Sparrow has a heavy heart. I think he's been carrying a big secret for a long time." Leora stepped forward, her translation collar emitting a soft chime. "Master Voss, this device, it is not a toy. I have seen them before. In the nebula. They were the eyes of the fire. They watched us from the clouds before the sky turned red." "Why are you fixing it?" Kalen didn't look up. "Because it's a design that deserves better than a trash heap, Leora. And because your daughter asked me to." He touched the solar to a microscopic junction near the drone's central logic gate. A spark jumped, bright as a dying star. For a moment, the workshop was plunged into a strobe light flicker. The holographic displays on the walls glitched, scrolling through streams of corrupted binary and ancient military coordinates. "Mnemonic status?" Kalen barked. The AI's voice was distorted, flickering between its standard baritone and a jagged, synthesized screech. "System interference detected. An unauthorized encryption core is attempting to bypass the local firewall. Sir, the drone's power signature is unusual. It's not a standard battery, it's a Wraith core." Kalen's blood ran cold. A Wraith core was a piece of experimental tech from the Black Ops divisions of the hegemony. They were designed to survive the total destruction of their host unit, preserving data even through nuclear fallout. They weren't just batteries, they were indestructible black boxes. The drone began to vibrate against the marble table. The quad rotors twitched, the gears grinding with the sound of rusted iron. Suddenly, the central optical sensor, the drone's single eye, flickered to life. It wasn't the soft, friendly blue of a toy. It was a piercing, aggressive crimson. Pip shrieked and fell back into her mother's arms. Leora snarled, her claws extending instinctively. Kalen didn't move. He kept the solder leveled, his eyes locked on the red eye. "Scanning," the drone announced. Its voice was a synthesized rasp, stripped of all artifice. It wasn't the voice of a storyteller. It was the voice of a weapon. Designation verified. "Hello, Commander Ghost." Kalen felt the world tilt. Ghost. That was his call sign during the Scorched Nebula campaign. It was a name that had been officially erased from the historical records, buried under layers of non-disclosure agreements and government silence. Sentry 7. "Stand down," Kalen commanded, his voice returning to the iron authority of the battlefield. "Protocol Alpha 6. Authorization, Voss V09. "Connection established," the drone replied. The red light softened to a flickering amber. "Warning, data integrity at 14%. Hostile entities detected in the vicinity during the last recording cycle. Commander, I have the logs from the Sector 4 archives. Do you wish to proceed with the final upload?" Sector 4. The words hit Kalen like a physical blow. Sector 4 was where the archives of the Syrinx civilization had been kept. It was also the site of the most brutal massacre of the war. A massacre that Kalen had been told was a tragic accident caused by a fuel cell explosion. "No," Kalen rasped. "Not now. Mnemonic, isolate the drone. No outbound transmissions." Leora stepped toward the table, her feathers bristling with a terrifying, jagged energy. "You," Leora said, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and realization. "You were the ghost? The one the story spoke of? The one who directed the fire from the shadows?" Kalen stood up, the solder iron dropping to the floor with a clatter. "Leora, listen to me. I listened to the fire," Leora screamed, her translation collar struggling to keep up with her raw, melodic grief. I listened to my sister scream, while the metal birds watched from above. My husband died trying to save the archives in Sector 4. He died because someone wanted to turn our history into mineral rights. Pip was crying now, a high-pitched warbling sound that vibrated through the metal of the room. "Sparrow," she sobbed. "Is Sparrow a bad bird?" Kaylin looked at the child, then at the mother. The luxury of the spire, the billions in his accounts, the empire he had built on the ashes of the nebula. It all felt like a fragile, hollow shell. He looked at the drone. The secret was there, trapped in a wraith core inside a broken toy. He realized then that Cassian Vane hadn't come to the Spire for a board meeting. He hadn't come to talk about profit margins or corporate restructuring. He had come because the Sentry 7 had been reactivated. He had come to finish what had started 10 years ago. "Mnemonic," Kalen said, his voice flat and cold. "Lock down the residential wing. Shut down the public elevators. Notify Petra to prep the scavenger vessel." "Sir?" the AI asked. "May I inquire as to the nature of the emergency?" "The past just walked into my workshop, mnemonic," Kalen said, picking up the drone and holding it as if it were a bomb. "And I think it's time we stopped running from it." He looked at Leora. Her feathers were still a sharp, defensive red, but her eyes were fixed on Pip. In that moment, Kalen saw the choice he had to make. He could hand over the drone to Vane, preserve his company, and let the truth stay buried. Or he could protect the mother and child who had inadvertently brought his sins back to the light. Family is a choice, his father had told him long ago, before the war had turned them both into ghosts. And Kalen Voss, a man who had chosen power for half a century, finally chose something else. "Leora," he said, his voice quiet, "I didn't save Sector 4. I didn't save your husband. But I am going to save your daughter. Get your things. We're leaving the Spire." The grand gala of the Ethelgard Spire was supposed to be a celebration of the quarterly earnings. It was a sea of shimmering silk, blue champagne, and the smell of artificial success. The elite of the solar system moved through the foyer like sharks in evening wear, their laughter a practiced melody that disguised the cold calculation of their conversations. But Kalen Voss was not at his own party. He was in his office, watching the panoramic view of the Oort Vale. The comet's ice dust swirled outside the transparent aluminum window, a beautiful, chaotic dance that reminded him of the nebula he had helped destroy. The door to the office slid open with a hiss. Cassian Vane walked in. He was a man of manufactured perfection, his skin grafts seamless, his suit a masterpiece of kinetic fabric that rippled like liquid gold. He carried a glass of whiskey that cost more than a colony ship. "Kalen," Cassian said, his voice a smooth, dangerous silk, "you're missing the festivities. The shareholders are asking why their champion is hiding in the dark." "I'm not hiding, Cassian," Kalen said without turning around. "I'm observing. It's a habit I picked up in the military. You learn more by watching the shadows than the lights." Cassian smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. "Ah, the military. Always the soldier, even when you're wearing a 5 million credit tuxedo. Is that why you've been tinkering with salvage, Kalen?" "My sensors picked up a very specific military frequency coming from your residential wing tonight. A Sentry 7 ping." Kalen turned slowly. The room was dim, the only light coming from the glowing nebula outside. "I'm a mechanic at heart, Cassian. I like to fix things that are broken. It's a hobby." "A dangerous hobby," Cassian said, taking a sip of his drink, "especially when those things contain data that was supposed to have been incinerated during the Nebula campaign. Sector 4 data, the kind of data that makes people very, very nervous." "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Kalen replied, his face a mask of stoicism. Cassian walked closer, his reflection shimmering in the window. "Don't play the fool, Kalen. It doesn't suit you. You were the commander on the ground. I was the one who processed the mineral rights. We both know what happened. We both know that the Syrinx archives weren't destroyed by a fuel leak. They were destroyed because knowledge is a barrier to progress. If the Syrinx knew the value of the lithium under their cities, they would have fought harder. So we took the city and the knowledge. And the people?" Kalen asked, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Collateral," Cassian said dismissively. "A rounding error in the grand equation of human expansion. But this drone, It's an anomaly. It has a wraith core. My sources tell me it's the only unit that escaped the sector before the thermal bombs dropped. And you have it. Kalen felt the weight of the drone in his pocket. It felt like a leaden anchor, dragging him down into the depths of his own history. I have a toy, Cassian. A gift for a child. Hand it over, Kalen, Cassian said, the smoothness vanishing from his voice, replaced by cold steel. Hand over the drone and the Syrinx maid. Sloan tells me you've developed a sentimental attachment. It's a liability. The board is already concerned about your erratic behavior. If you surrender the asset now, we can spin this as a security breach. You stay in power. The girl goes to a re-education center. Everyone wins. Kalen looked at Cassian Vane. He saw a man who had never felt the heat of a plasma bolt or the smell of vaporized ozone. He saw a man who viewed the universe as a spreadsheet. The girl is not an asset, Kalen said, and she's not going to a re-education center. Then you are choosing treason, Cassian said, setting his glass down on the obsidian desk with a sharp click. The hegemony has already authorized a lockdown. The spire is being designated a containment zone. If you don't comply, we will take the station by force. Kalen walked toward the desk. He leaned in, his face inches from Cassian's. You think you know force? I've seen stars die, Cassian. I've seen planets burn. You're a man who fights with lawyers and contracts. I'm a man who fights with my hands. Kalen! A voice shouted from the doorway. Sloan stood there, her face a mask of professional concern. She was Kalen's top advisor, the woman who had managed his public image for a decade. She looked between the two men, her eyes flitting to the datapad in Cassian's hand. Kalen, listen to him, Sloan said, her voice trembling. The blockade is already moving in. If you resist, they'll strip you of everything. The shipyard, the spire, your legacy. Think of what you've built. I'm thinking about what I destroyed, Sloan, Kalen said, without looking at her. And I'm thinking about a little girl who thinks a drone is a bird. It's just a piece of junk, Kalen, Sloan cried. Why are you doing this for a servant and a broken toy? Because the toy is the only thing in this station that's telling the truth, Kalen said. And the servant has more honor in her little finger than this entire board has in its collective soul. Cassian Vane let out a short, dry laugh. Sentimental to the end. It's a tragic way to die, Kalen. Very well. Mnemonic, execute protocol blackout. Sir? The AI asked. Override authorized, Cassian shouted. As chairman of the Oversight Committee, I am invoking emergency containment. Sever all external communication. Lock all residential bays. The room plunged into darkness, the only light the red emergency strobes. The hum of the life support shifted to a heavy, sluggish thrum. Kalen felt the station tilt. The gravity generators were being throttled. Kalen didn't wait. He didn't argue. He moved. He lunged across the desk, grabbing Cassian by the throat. It wasn't a corporate move. It was a soldier's strike. He slammed the younger man against the transparent aluminum window. The lockdown is a two-way street, Cassian, Kalen hissed. If I can't leave, neither can you. Kalen, stop, Sloan yelled, reaching for her own comms unit. Security to the office. Kalen let go of Cassian and turned to the window. He didn't look at Sloan. He looked at the nebula. Petra, he said into his wrist comm. Plan B. Now. A series of muffled explosions rocked the spire. These weren't from the hegemony's lances. They were internal. Kalen's own demolition charges, planted years ago for a day he had always feared would come. The office door fused shut as the magnetic seals overloaded. Leora, Pip, get to the hangar, Kalen whispered into the comms. I'm coming for you. He turned back to Cassian Vane, who was gasping for air, clutching his throat. You think I'm an old man who's lost his edge, Cassian? Kalen said, his voice cold as the ice outside. You forgot one thing? I didn't just build this spire. I built the ships that are currently surrounding it. And the crews on those ships, they don't work for the hegemony. They work for me. The office shook again as the hegemony's blockade began to fire. The war for the truth had officially begun, and in the dark of the spire, Kalen Voss realized he had never felt more alive. He had lost his company, his reputation, and his safety. But for the first time in 10 years, he was no longer a ghost. He was a father protecting his own. He grabbed a heavy pulse rifle from a hidden compartment under his desk and checked the charge. "Sloan," he said, looking at his advisor one last time, "if you want to survive the next hour, I suggest you find a very deep hole and stay in it." He blew the lock on the office's secondary service exit and disappeared into the maintenance shafts. The billionaire human veteran had made his choice. He had heard a child cry over a broken toy, and his response was going to shock the entire galaxy. The battle for the spire of Ethelgard had begun, and the truth was no longer a secret. It was a weapon. The maintenance shafts of the spire were a labyrinth of cold steel and vibrating conduits, the industrial intestines of a city that pretended to be a palace. Down here, the jasmine-scented air of the upper tiers was replaced by the smell of stagnant coolant and the metallic tang of recycled oxygen. Kalen Voss moved through the narrow crawl spaces with a grace that his aging body shouldn't have possessed, his knees clicking with every rhythmic step. He found them in a junction room beneath the secondary life support hub. Pip was huddled in a corner, her feathers a dull, terrified gray, while Leora stood guard with the pulse pistol leveled at the vent Kalen had just exited. "It's me," Kalen rasped, sliding into the dim light of the junction. Leora didn't lower the weapon. Her feathers were a jagged electric violet, the Syrinx color for profound betrayal. "The ghost," she whispered, the word carrying more weight than a death sentence. "You didn't just fight in the nebula. You were the one who orchestrated the silence. You were the architect of the void." Kalen leaned against a pulsating pipe, his breath coming in shallow hitches. He looked at the drone clutched in his hand. Sparrow's red eye was dark now, but the machine felt heavy, as if it were vibrating with the weight of the souls it had cataloged. "I was a soldier, Leora," Kalen said, his voice flat. "I followed orders I believed were for the preservation of the hegemony. I was told Sector 4 was a rebel stronghold, a nest of extremists who would rather burn their history than share the stars. And you believe them?" Leora's voice rose, a sharp, melodic trill that echoed off the steel walls. "You saw our libraries. You saw the nurseries. You saw my people holding books instead of rifles, and you still gave the order to calibrate the thermal lances?" "I didn't give the order for the lances," Kalen said, his eyes finally meeting hers. The stoic mask of the billionaire CEO had crumbled, leaving behind a man who looked like he had been hollowed out from the inside. "I was told there was a strategic asset in Sector 4, a data core that could end the war. My mission was to secure it. When the lances fired, I was on the ground. I was in the middle of the fire. I thought I was the only one who made it out." Pip crawled out from her corner, her small hand reaching for the hem of Kalen's grease-stained shirt. "The bird says you're lying, Uncle Kalen, but not the bad kind of lying. He says you're lying to yourself." Kalen looked down at the child. Her feathers were beginning to shift, a faint, hopeful amber bleeding into the gray. "Pip, stay back," Leora commanded, but her aim was wavering. "The bird remembers a story," Pip continued, her voice hauntingly calm. "He remembers a man in a black suit, covered in ash, holding a bundle. He remembers the man crying. Do ghosts cry, Uncle Kalen?" Kalen's hand trembled. He reached out and tapped a sequence into Sparrow's chassis. The drone's eye didn't turn red this time. It pulsed with a soft, flickering gold. A holographic projection shimmered into existence, filling the cramped junction room with a ghostly blue light. The memory was fragmented, a mosaic of static and pain, but the image was clear. A younger Kalen, his armor scorched, kneeling in the ruins of a Sector 4 nursery. He wasn't firing a rifle. He was cradling a bundle of feathers, a Syrinx infant, and he was shouting into a comms unit, a desperate, frantic plea for an evacuation that never came. "They told me the sector was empty," Kalen whispered, staring at his younger self. "They told me the civilians had been moved when I found the babies. When I realized the lances were already locked on, I tried to call it off, but someone had severed my frequency. They wanted the sector wiped. No witnesses, no archives, just the lithium." Leora lowered the pistol. Her feathers were a chaotic swirl of colors, grief, confusion, and a burgeoning, painful realization. "You tried to save them?" "I saved one," Kalen said, his voice breaking. "I got her to a transport. I thought I was too late for everyone else. I spent 10 years building this spire, building this empire, thinking that if I became powerful enough, I could make up for the 1 hour I was powerless. But the truth is, I was just building a bigger cage for my guilt. He held out the drone. The Wraith Core doesn't just have coordinates, Leora. It has the original mission logs. The ones that prove Cassian Vane gave the order to fire on a sector he knew was full of civilians. He didn't just want the minerals. He wanted to erase the Syrinx culture so there would be no one left to claim the land. And Sloane? Leora asked. Sloane was my legal aid back then, Kalen said, a cold realization washing over him. She was the one who lost the logs. She didn't manage my legacy, Leora. She managed my silence. A sudden, sharp vibration rattled the junction. The sound of heavy mag boots echoed from the shaft above. The hegemony wasn't just searching, they were hunting. The cost of the truth is everything I own, Kalen said, looking at the two Syrinx who had become more of a family to him in 3 days than his board had in 3 decades. But the cost of the lie is Pip's future. I'm done paying that price. Leora looked at Kalen, then at her daughter. She reached out and took Kalen's hand. Her skin was warm, her grip firm. For the first time, she didn't look at him as a master or a monster. She looked at him as a man who was finally choosing to stand. Then we make them pay, Leora said. The Syrinx don't just sing, Kalen. We remember, and it's time the galaxy heard our song. The hangar bay of the spire was a cavernous vault of translucent glass and white composite, usually reserved for Kalen's private fleet of luxury yachts. Now, it was a kill zone. Hegemony shock troops, encased in silent matte gray power armor, had descended from the ceiling like spiders on silk threads. They moved with a synchronized, terrifying precision, their pulse rifles leveled at the only ship left in the bay. The Scavenger, an ugly, blocky tug ship that Kalen used for asteroid prospecting. Sloane stood at the center of the bay, her evening gown replaced by a sharp, tactical jumpsuit. She looked at the shadows where Kalen, Leora, and Pip were hiding behind a stack of cargo crates. Kalen, don't be a martyr! Sloane's voice was amplified by the hangar's intercom, echoing with a metallic, artificial clarity. The hegemony has already frozen your accounts. Your loyal crews have been replaced. You're a man with no shadow, holding a toy that belongs to the state. Give us the drone, and I can still save the girl. I've arranged a transport to the Rim Worlds. She'll be safe. She'll be anonymous? Kalen peered over the edge of the crate. He saw the tactical layout. 12 guards, 2 automated turrets, and Sloane, the woman he had trusted with his life, holding a remote detonator for the Scavenger's fuel lines. She's lying, Uncle Kalen, Pip whispered, her hand resting on the Sentry 7 drone. The child's feathers were a deep, resonant amber, almost glowing. The bird says her heart sounds like a broken engine. There is no transport, only the void. I know, Pip, Kalen said. He turned to Leora. I need 3 minutes. The Scavenger has a Chronos drive, but it's a prototype. It folds time to bypass the maglocks. If I can get to the cockpit, I can punch us out of here before the lances fire. And the guards? Leora asked, checking the charge on her pistol. They're trained to fight soldiers, Kalen said, a grim smile touching his lips. They're not trained to fight a station that's being deconstructed from the inside. He tapped his wrist comm. Mnemonic execute Ragnarok protocol. Authorization, the last command. Confirmed, Commander, the AI replied. It has been an honor. Suddenly, the gravity in the hangar bay vanished. The shock troops, balanced for the station's standard 1G, drifted upward, their boots losing purchase on the polished floor. The blue champagne from a tipped-over gala table rose in shimmering spherical orbs, floating like miniature planets. Now! Kalen roared. He kicked off the crate, using his momentum to glide through the zero-G environment. He didn't move like a 60-year-old man. He moved like a creature of the void. Lyra followed, Pip tucked under one arm, her feathers splayed out to help stabilize their flight. The shock troops began to fire. Blue pulses of energy hissed through the air, vaporizing the floating champagne spheres into clouds of steam. One shot grazed Kalen's shoulder, tearing through his shirt and searing the skin. But he didn't stop. Sloane screamed into her comms, her voice lost in the chaos. She tried to activate the detonator, but Mnemonic had already rerouted the station's power grid into the structural integrity fields. Kalen reached the ramp of the Scavenger. He grabbed a handrail and hauled himself in, Leora and Pip sliding in behind him. Petra, status! Kalen yelled as he sprinted for the cockpit. The security head was already in the pilot's seat, her fingers a blur over the manual overrides. "The mag locks are still active, sir. If we fire the thrusters, we'll tear the ship in half." "Don't fire the thrusters," Kalen said, dropping into the co-pilot's seat. "Fire the Chronos drive. We're not going through the locks, Petra. We're going around them." "Sir, the time sickness—" "Do it!" The ship began to groan, the metal screaming as the Chronos drive began to fold the space-time around the vessel. Outside, the hangar bay began to distort. The light shifted from white to a blinding, kaleidoscopic spectrum. Kalen looked at Pip. The child was staring out the viewport, her feathers glowing with a brilliance that rivaled the drive's core. She wasn't afraid. She was fascinated. "Uncle Kalen," she whispered, "the bird, he's singing now. He's telling the story of the stars that don't go out." Sloane appeared at the viewport, her face pressed against the glass, her expression a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She realized too late that Kalen wasn't just escaping. He was taking the truth with him. "Goodbye, Sloane," Kalen said, his hand hovering over the final engagement switch. "I hope the legacy was worth the silence." He slammed the switch. The world turned into a single, needle-thin point of light. The scavenger didn't move forward. It simply ceased to be in the spire's reality. When Kalen's vision cleared, they were in the deep dark of the Oort Vale, miles from the spire. The silence was absolute. He looked at Leora. Her feathers were a soft, peaceful amber. He looked at Pip. She was smiling, her small hands still resting on the drone. But the cost was immediate. Kalen looked at his hands. They were translucent, the skin shimmering with a faint, ghostly afterimage. The time sickness was already taking hold. He had saved them, but in doing so, he had untethered himself from the very reality he had fought to protect. "We're clear," Petra said, her voice shaking. "But the hegemony fleet, they're already recalibrating. We have an hour, maybe less, before they find our temporal signature." Kalen stood up, his body feeling as light as a memory. He looked at the drone, its red eye now a steady, truthful blue. "Then we don't hide," Kalen said. "We broadcast. Mnemonic, open a wideband frequency. Patch it into every receiver from Earth to the belt. It's time to tell the galaxy about Sector 4. He looked at Leora, his heart finally finding the rhythm he had lost 10 years ago. "I'm sorry it took me so long to remember who I was." Leora didn't say anything. She simply leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. It was a Syrinx gesture of absolute trust. In the cold, empty void of space, Kalen Voss had lost his empire, his body, and his past. But he had finally found his family. The scavenger drifted like a dead whale in the graveyard of the Oort Vale. Outside the viewports, ancient chunks of ice and frozen methane, some as large as cities and others as small as pebbles, tumbled in a slow, silent waltz. The light of the distant sun was a mere pinprick, cold and indifferent, illuminating the jagged edges of the debris with a spectral, silver glow. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the rhythmic, labored breathing of 3 fugitives. Kalen Voss sat on the deck of the engine room, his back against the vibrating housing of the Chronos drive. He looked at his hands. They were no longer solid. They flickered like a holographic projection on a low battery, translucent and ghostly. The time sickness was not just a nausea of the mind, it was a physical unraveling. By jumping the ship through a temporal fold without a stabilized anchor, he had untethered his molecules from the present. He was becoming a memory in real time. Leora knelt beside him, her feathers a muted, worried amber. She reached out to touch his shoulder, but her hand passed through the outer layer of his shirt as if it were made of smoke. She recoiled, a soft melodic gasp escaping her translation collar. "Kalen," she whispered, "your heart, it sounds like it is beating in a different room." "I am fine," Kalen lied, his voice sounding thin, as if it were being broadcast from a great distance. "It is just the displacement. My body is trying to decide which second it belongs in. We have more important problems." He gestured to the Sentry 7 drone sitting between them. Sparrow's red eye was dark, but a faint violet pulse emanated from its core. The Wraith core was locked. The final TIFF, the one that contained the raw, unedited footage of the Sector 4 massacre and the direct orders from Cassian Vane, was behind a biometric wall that even Kalen's military overrides couldn't bypass. "It needs a resonance," Pip said. The child was sitting on a pile of thermal blankets, her eyes fixed on the drone. Her feathers were glowing with a steady, crystalline white light, a color Kalen had never seen on a Syrinx before. It was the color of ancient ice, of purity, of the archives they had lost. "What do you mean, Pip?" Kalen asked. "The bird is crying," Pip said, her voice small but certain. "He is not locked because he wants to hide. He is locked because he is waiting for the song. The man who made him, the man in the ash. He put a song inside. Only someone who feels the same way can open it." Kalen looked at Leora. The Syrinx woman's eyes were wet. She knew what Pip was talking about. The Syrinx did not just store data in silicon, they stored it in harmonic frequencies. Their archives were vast libraries of sound, where history was sung rather than written. "My husband," Leora said, her voice trembling. "He was the keeper of the third octave. He was responsible for the cultural memory of our people. If he put the data into that drone, he wouldn't have used a password. He would have used a heart key, a specific emotional frequency that can only be generated by a Syrinx in a state of absolute truth." Kalen looked at his translucent hands. He was a man of logic, of steel, of cold military precision. He didn't know how to sing a heart key. He only knew how to follow orders and build empires. "I cannot do it," Kalen said. "I am a ghost, Leora. There is nothing left in me but the echoes of a war I wish I could forget." "You are wrong," Leora said, standing up. She walked toward him, and this time she didn't try to touch him with her hands. She leaned in and pressed her forehead against his, a gesture of profound intimacy and shared burden. "You are not a ghost because of the war, Kalen. You are a ghost because you have been living for a legacy that was never yours. You have been building a spire to hide your heart, but Pip sees you. I see you." Pip stood up and walked over, placing her small hands on the drone. "Uncle Kalen, the bird doesn't want a soldier. He wants a father." Kalen closed his eyes. He felt the vibration of the ship, the cold of the Oort Vale, and the warmth of the two beings who had chosen to stay with him when they could have run. He thought about the billionaire he was 3 days ago, a man who lived in a vacuum of luxury, surrounded by people who only loved his shadow. And then he thought about the man he was now, a flickering, dying engineer sitting on a rusted deck, finally understanding that the only empire worth having was the one that fit inside this room. He reached out and placed his hand over Pip's on the drone. He didn't try to bypass the encryption. He didn't think about codes or military protocols. He simply allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of the love he had found in the middle of a disaster. He felt the grief for the people he couldn't save and the fierce, burning need to protect the child in front of him. The drone began to hum. The violet light in its core intensified, shifting from a jagged pulse to a smooth, resonant glow. The sound it emitted was no longer a mechanical drone. It was a chord, a beautiful, haunting harmony that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the scavenger. "Bioresonance confirmed," Sparrow's voice said, but it was no longer a rasp. It was a clear, melodic tone. "Heart key accepted." Unlocking the Sector 4 archive, a hologram erupted from the drone, filling the engine room with light. It wasn't just a video, it was a 360-degree immersion. They were back in the fire. They saw the Syrinx city crumbling. They saw the hegemony ships in the sky. And then they saw the bridge of the flagship. They saw Cassian Vane, younger and hungrier, looking at a tactical map. "The archive is the only thing that matters," Vane's voice said in the recording. "If the Syrinx can prove their ancestral claim to the lithium veins, we lose billions in mineral rights. Burn the sector. Leave no one to testify." "And what about Commander Voss?" a voice asked, Sloane's voice cold and efficient. "Voss is a blunt instrument," Vane replied. "He'll do his job. When it's over, we'll tell him it was a fuel cell accident. He'll feel guilty enough to stay loyal, but too broken to ask questions." The hologram faded, leaving the engine room in a stunned silence. Leora was shaking, her feathers a brilliant, tragic white. Pip was staring at the space where the images had been, her small face set in a mask of solemnity that no child should have to wear. Kalen felt the last of his corporate identity dissolve. He wasn't just a victim of a lie. He had been the weapon the lie was built around. He looked at Leora. "I was the blunt instrument," he whispered. "You were the shield," Leora corrected him, her voice strong. "They wanted to use your honor to bury their crimes, but you didn't let them. You saved the only archive that matters. She pointed to Pip. The child is the history, Kalen, Leora said, and now the galaxy is going to hear it. The peace of the Oort Veil was shattered by the arrival of the hegemony. A massive shadow blotted out the distant stars as the Apex, the flagship of the Vane hegemony, dropped out of hyperspace. It was a brutalist spike of obsidian and chrome, 3 kilometers of cold industrial malice. It didn't hail them. It didn't offer terms. It simply deployed a swarm of anchor drones, machines designed to project a localized gravity well that would prevent any ship from jumping to hyperspace. Inside the scavenger, the alarms began to wail, a high-pitched scream that set Kalen's teeth on edge. The deck plates groaned as the gravity well began to tug at the ship's hull, trying to pull it toward the Apex's massive hangar maw. Kalen stood at the helm, his form flickering more violently now. Every time the ship was hit by a gravity pulse, he felt a piece of his consciousness slip away, lost to the temporal void. Petra, get the broadcast array ready, Kalen ordered. We need to push the data through the hegemony's jamming field. It's too thick, sir, Petra shouted, her hands flying over the controls. They're using a multi-phasic scrambler. Unless we can get within point-blank range of their primary receiver dish, the signal will just be noise. Leora looked at the Apex, then at Kalen. Point-blank range? That means we have to fly straight into their hangar. It's a suicide run. Kalen didn't answer. He was staring at the communication monitor. A signal was coming through. A private channel, encrypted with his own personal code. He swiped the screen. Cassian Vane's face filled the monitor. He looked calm, seated in his high-back command chair, a glass of water on the armrest. Behind him, the bridge of the Apex was a hive of quiet, lethal activity. Kalen, Cassian said, his voice smooth and paternal. Look at you. You're literally falling apart. The time sickness is going to erase you in an hour. Is this really how you want the story of Kalen Voss to end? As a ghost on a trash ship? I've had worse endings in mind, Cassian, Kalen said, his voice a distorted whisper. Let's be reasonable, Cassian continued. I've already spoken to the board. We've reached a consensus. We'll reinstate you. We'll give you back the spire. We'll even provide the medical technology to stabilize your temporal signature. You can be solid again, Kalen. You can be the king of the Oort Veil once more. And the price? Kalen asked. The price is the drone, Cassian said, and the searing samples. We need to study the child's resonance. It's a biological anomaly that could revolutionize our communication grids. They'll be well cared for, I promise. Luxury suites, the best food, a life of comfort. Kalen looked at Leora. He looked at Pip. He saw the way Pip was holding Leora's hand, her small feathers trembling, but her eyes fixed on him. He saw the choice Cassian was offering him. It was the choice he had made his entire life. The choice of the architect, the choice of the billionaire, the choice of the man who valued the system over the soul. He could have his life back. He could have his body back. He could go back to the jasmine-scented air and the black marble floors. All he had to do was choose the bloodless legacy over the living family. Leora walked to the helm. She didn't say anything. She didn't plead. She simply looked at Kalen, her amber eyes reflecting the flickering light of his dying form. She was waiting for the man she had seen in the archive memory, the man who had held a baby in the middle of a fire. Kalen turned back to the monitor. He looked Cassian Vane in the eye. You're right, Cassian, Kalen said. I am falling apart. But for the first time in 60 years, I can finally see through the smoke. He reached out his flickering hand and hovered it over the self-destruct override for the Kronos drive. The spire was never my home, Cassian, Kalen said, his voice suddenly clear and resonant, amplified by the very temporal distortion that was killing him. It was just a monument to my fear. And I don't need your doctors. I've found the only cure that matters. Kalen, what are you doing? Cassian's voice sharpened, the mask of calm slipping. I'm fulfilling my contract, Kalen said. The one I signed in the ash of Sector 4. He slammed his hand down on the console, but he didn't trigger the self-destruct. He triggered the temporal ejection. The scavenger didn't jump to hyperspace. Instead, it accelerated. Not through space, but through a narrow, localized sliver of time. The ship became a blur of silver light, a needle-thin streak that bypassed the Apex's shields by simply not existing in the same microsecond as the energy walls. They punched into the Apex's primary hangar bay, with the force of a falling star. The scavenger's hull groaned as it slammed into the landing deck, skidding across the polished floor, sparking and screaming as it tore through the hegemony's luxury shuttles. Kalen stood up, his body now almost completely transparent. He could see the stars through his own chest. "Petra Leora, take Pip in the drone," Kalen commanded. "The broadcast dish is on the deck above. Go. Now!" "Kalen, you're not coming," Pip cried, her feathers turning a desperate morning gray. "I have to hold the drive, Pip," Kalen said, kneeling down one last time. "If I leave the console, the temporal field collapses and the Apex's internal shields will cut off the signal. I have to be the anchor." He reached out to touch her face. He couldn't feel her skin, but he could feel the warmth of her resonance. "You were right, Pip," Kalen whispered. "Sparrow wasn't a bad bird. He just needed someone to hear his song. Now go and sing it for the whole galaxy." Leora grabbed Pip in the drone. She looked at Kalen, her eyes full of a grief that was also a profound, beautiful pride. She didn't say goodbye. She simply nodded once, a queen acknowledging her greatest knight. They disappeared into the smoke and fire of the hangar. Kalen turned to the console. The Apex's security teams were already swarming the ship. Plasma bolts began to sizzle through the cockpit, passing through Kalen's ghostly form without effect. He was beyond their reach now. He was a creature of the fold. He looked at the broadcast monitor. The data was flowing. The images of Sector 4, the recordings of Cassian Vane, the history of the Syrinx, it was all screaming out across the solar system, bypassing every jammer, every firewall, every lie. Kalen Voss sat back in the pilot's seat. He felt the cold of the void, but he also felt the warmth of the sun. He looked at his hands, which were now nothing more than a faint shimmering light. He wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't a veteran. He wasn't the ghost of the nebula. He was a man who had chosen to be a father. And as the Apex's reactor began to fail, overloaded by the temporal feedback of the Chronos drive, Kalen Voss closed his eyes and listened to the song. It was a song about a knight, a bird, and a family that was chosen in the heart of a star. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The broadcast did not merely travel, it detonated. Across the inner planets, from the gleaming spires of Earth to the domed industrial hubs of Mars, and out into the rugged asteroid-mined frontiers of the belt. Every screen, every neural link, and every public terminal flickered and died for exactly 3 seconds. When they returned, they did not display the polished propaganda of the Vane hegemony or the sterile stock tickers of the Ethelgard board. They displayed the truth. In the command center of the Apex, the air was thick with the scent of electrical fire and the frantic shouting of officers who had spent their lives believing they were the masters of the universe. Cassian Vane stood at the center of the chaos, his liquid gold suit reflecting the strobing red of the emergency lights. He stared at the primary tactical screen, which was no longer showing sensor data. Instead, it showed the face of a dying Syrinx man in a bunker 10 years ago. It showed the thermal lances of the hegemony firing on a nursery. "Cut the feed!" Cassian screamed, his voice cracking, the cultured veneer of the billionaire statesman finally shattering into the jagged shards of a cornered animal. "Use the secondary relay. Jam the entire sector." "We can't, sir," an officer replied, her voice trembling as she backed away from her console. "The signal is coming from inside our own hangar. It's using our primary broadcast array as a magnifying lens. It's not just a transmission anymore. It's a resonant loop. It's burning out the firewalls from the inside." On the deck of the Scavenger, deep in the bowels of the Apex's hangar, Lyra and Petra stood by the makeshift relay they had constructed. Pip was tucked behind a bulkhead, her feathers glowing with a brilliant, steady white light that seemed to soothe the raw, ozone-heavy air. The drone Sparrow hovered between them, its blue eye projecting the final fragments of the archive. The images were undeniable. They saw the transaction logs signed by Sloan. They saw the hidden lithium contracts. They saw the face of Kalen Voss, younger and ash-covered, pleading for a life that Cassian Vane had ordered to be extinguished. The galaxy was watching. In the mining tunnels of Ceres, workers stopped their drills. In the high-rise apartments of New Tokyo, families huddled around their hollows. The silence that followed the broadcast was a collective indrawing of breath, a moment where the weight of a decade of lies finally crushed the foundation of the hegemony. He is doing it, Leora whispered, her hand over her heart. Kalen is holding the anchor. In the cockpit of the Scavenger, Kalen Voss was no longer a man. He was a pillar of shimmering, translucent light. His hands were fused to the controls of the Chronos drive, his molecules vibrating at a frequency that defied the laws of physics. Every time the Apex fired its internal dampeners to try and crush the ship, Kalen absorbed the energy, channeling it back into the temporal fold. He was the only reason the ship hadn't been vaporized. The pain was beyond anything he had felt on the battlefield. It felt like his soul was being pulled through a needle's eye, a million miles in every direction at once. But he didn't let go. He thought about the sound of Pip's laughter. He thought about the way Leora looked at him when she realized he had tried to save her husband. He thought about the billionaire he used to be, a man who had everything and possessed nothing. "You are a ghost, Kalen," a voice whispered in his ear. He looked up. Sloane was standing in the doorway of the cockpit. She had followed them through the maintenance shafts, her tactical suit scorched, a pulse pistol in her hand. Her face was a mask of calculated fury. "You're dying for a memory, Kalen," Sloane said, her voice shaking. "Look at yourself. You're fading into the void. If you let go now, I can still kill the signal. I can tell the board you were compromised by alien tech. We can survive this. We can go back to the way things were." Kalen looked at her through eyes that were now nothing but glowing apertures of white light. He saw the woman he had trusted for 10 years, the woman who had helped him build his empire by hiding his humanity. "The way things were was a lie, Sloane," Kalen said, his voice sounding like the hum of 1,000 stars. "And I'm done being a ghost in your machine." Sloane raised the pistol, her finger tightening on the trigger, but she hesitated. She looked at the screen behind Kalen, where the images of the nebula were still playing. She saw her own signature on the death warrants. She saw the faces of the children she had helped erase. In that moment, the humanistic weight of Kalen's sacrifice hit her. He wasn't fighting for power. He wasn't even fighting for justice. He was fighting for the right to be a father to a child that wasn't his, in a world that he had helped break. "I can't let you destroy everything," Sloane whispered. "Then you'll have to shoot the ghost," Kalen said. Sloane didn't shoot. She dropped the pistol. It clattered on the deck, sounding small and hollow against the roar of the Chronos drive. She fell to her knees, her head in her hands. The armor she had worn for a decade, the armor of cold corporate logic, had finally cracked. The broadcast reached its crescendo. The final image was not of a war or a crime. It was a recording of a Syrinx lullaby, the one Leora's husband had sung to Pip before the world ended. It was a song of hope, of the stars that don't go out, of the family that is chosen in the dark. And then, the Apex's reactor gave way. The temporal feedback from the Scavenger's drive reached a critical mass. The ship didn't explode. It simply imploded into a localized fold of time. The Apex was tossed backward by a massive, silent wave of gravity, its engines failing, its shields flickering out. Inside the Scavenger, the light began to fade. Kalen felt the ground return. He felt the weight of his boots. He felt the air in his lungs. He slumped forward over the console, his body solid once more, but scarred with the jagged, glowing lines of temporal burns. The silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of the Oort Vale. It was the silence of a new beginning. 6 months had passed since the fall of the Vane hegemony. The spire of Ethelgard was no longer a monument to corporate intimidation. The black marble floors had been replaced with living moss and crystalline gardens, a gift from the Syrinx survivors who had returned to the comet's core. The gold inlay was gone, melted down to fund the reconstruction of the nebula colonies. The station had a new name, the Harbor of the Third Octave. It was no longer a residence for the elite. It was a sanctuary for the displaced. Humans and Syrinx walked the halls together, the translation collars now tools of connection rather than submission. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming jasmine, a real scent this time, not a synthetic imitation. Kalen Voss stood on the observation deck, watching the first transport ship depart for the Viridian moons. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a tactical suit. He wore a simple, grease-stained jumpsuit, the pockets full of micro-drivers and soldering wire. His hair was whiter than it had been, and he walked with a slight limp, his left leg still shimmering with the occasional, ghostly flicker of the time sickness. The billionaire human veteran had lost his fortune, his company, and his reputation. In the eyes of the law, he was a reformed traitor. In the eyes of the shareholders, he was a madman. But in the eyes of the child running toward him, he was something else entirely. "Uncle Kalen!" Pip shouted, her feathers a brilliant, joyful orange that matched the sunset of the distant twin suns. "Sparrow won't stop singing. I think his vocal synth is jammed." Kalen knelt, ignoring the protest of his knee. He took the drone from her hands. Sparrow's casing was no longer matte black. It was painted with bright, chaotic swirls of color. Pip's handiwork. The blue eye flickered, and a soft, rhythmic purr emanated from its speaker. "He isn't jammed, Pip," Kalen said, his voice warm and resonant. "He's just happy. Drones like to be busy. They like to have a purpose that isn't just watching things burn." "Can we fix the hypercoms today?" Pip asked, her amber eyes bright with curiosity. "Leora says the mining ships need a new frequency for the nebula run." "We can fix anything, Pip," Kalen said, ruffling the soft down on her head, "as long as we have the right tools." Leora walked up the ramp, carrying 2 cups of steaming tea. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was the administrator of the harbor, the voice of her people. She wore a robe of woven silk and light, her feathers a calm, deep amber. "The board meeting is in an hour, Kalen," Leora said, a playful spark in her eyes. "The new directors want to know why you've spent 3 million credits on obsolete planetary sensors." "Tell them those sensors are for the children," Kalen said, taking a sip of the tea, "so they can see the stars without having to look through a targeting reticle. If they don't like it, they can fire me again. I hear I'm very good at being unemployed." Leora laughed, a sound that was no longer a melodic trill of caution, but a clear, open note of joy. "You are a terrible billionaire, Kalen Voss." "And a mediocre ghost," Kalen added, looking out at the stars. He walked to the edge of the deck, leaning his elbows on the railing. He looked at his hands, solid, scarred, and capable. He thought about the journey he had taken from the black marble mausoleum to this living, breathing home. He thought about the legacy he had once feared losing, only to realize that a legacy wasn't something you built with stone and steel. It was something you planted in the hearts of those you loved. "I used to look at the stars and see mineral rights," Kalen thought. "I used to look at people and see variables. I built a spire to reach the heavens, thinking that the higher I went, the further I could get from the dirt on my hands. But I was just building a taller cage." He realized now that the most powerful thing he had ever done wasn't directing a fleet or managing a billion-credit merger. It was sitting on a cold floor and fixing a broken wing for a child who had no reason to trust him. It was choosing to be part of a family that the world said shouldn't exist. We are all broken in some way, he realized. We are all like Sparrow, carrying secrets and scars that we don't know how to repair. But we don't have to fix ourselves alone. Kalen turned to Pip, who was busy trying to teach Sparrow how to dance by waving a magnet wand. "I spent 60 years trying to be an architect of systems," Kalen mused, his voice a soft whisper in the wind. "But I think I'm much better at being an architect of hope. It doesn't pay as well, but the view is much better." He looked at Leora, who was watching him with a quiet, knowing smile. He looked at the child, the bird, and the harbor they had built together. He wasn't a veteran of a war anymore. He was a veteran of life, finally learning how to live it. "I wonder," Kalen thought, looking out at the infinite dark of the Oort Vale, which was no longer empty, but filled with the lights of 1,000 returning ships. "I wonder how many of us are living in spires of our own making, surrounded by wealth we don't need, hiding from a past we can't change. We wait for a grand sign, a miracle, or a hero to save us. But what if the key to our freedom is something as small as a child's tear? What would happen if you stopped building your empire for a moment and simply sat on the floor with someone who needed you? Would you find that the world you were so afraid of losing was actually the cage you finally needed to escape?" Kalen reached out and picked up a small, discarded copper washer from the deck. He polished it against his jumpsuit and handed it to Pip. "For the collection, Master Mechanic," he said. Pip beamed, tucking the treasure into her belt. "Thanks, Uncle Kalen. Are we ready to work?" Kalen smiled, a genuine crooked smile that didn't show any teeth, but lit up his eyes like a sun. "We're ready, Pip. Let's go fix the stars." The two of them walked back toward the workshop, their shadows merging into one as they disappeared into the warm golden light of the station's heart.